I'm a woman in my mid-20s, and I've spent the last few years building a life where I can stand on my own 2 feet. I grew up in a regular middle-class family. Nothing fancy, but I worked hard through school and managed to land a stable marketing job. I cover my rent every month, I budget, I buy my own clothes, and I've always felt proud of the fact that I don't have to depend on anyone else. That part of my life was steady and good, until my cousin Laura and my aunt Diane decided to make me their running joke. Laura is a few years older than me, married, with kids. From the outside, she likes to project that she's the together one, the generous mom who has everything figured out. She started passing me her old clothes, shoes, and bags a couple of years ago. At first, I didn't see it as a big deal. She'd bring over bags after family gatherings, smiling and saying things like, "These might be useful for you." I assumed it came from a good place, so I thanked her and took them. When I opened those bags at home, though, it was a different story. Most of the clothes were outdated, things that had been sitting in her closet for 10 years. Shirts with yellowed collars, shoes with the soles half detached, handbags where the straps were literally tearing off. I found dresses with stains down the front, and a sweater with holes in both elbows. It wasn't charity, it was trash she didn't want to deal with. Still, I let it go at first. I thought maybe she just didn't realize how bad the stuff was. My Aunt Diane, her mom, was always in the background hyping her up. If I ever tried to politely decline, Diane would swoop in with, "Don't be wasteful." People would be grateful to get things for free. It was never phrased as an offer, it was more of an order. I started feeling like I couldn't say no without being called spoiled. Eventually, I decided I'd quietly donate the bags instead. At least that way the things could be sorted properly. Some might even find use somewhere. But Laura caught on. One day she asked me why she hadn't seen me wearing the jacket she gave me. I tried brushing it off, saying it wasn't really my style, but she pressed harder. She wanted proof that I was using her hand-me-downs, like I owed her gratitude for offloading her junk. The tension really blew open at a family barbecue. Diane was in rare form that day, playing hostess and making sure all eyes were on her. At one point, she got loud enough for everyone to hear and announced, "Rachel thinks she's too good for free stuff. Imagine being so ungrateful when people try to help you." She smirked, and the table erupted in laughter. I stood there holding a paper plate, feeling like I'd been shoved into the spotlight as the punchline. I tried to defend myself. I said I buy my own clothes, that I work full-time, and I wasn't ungrateful, I just didn't want things I couldn't use. Diane twisted every word I said into something else. She repeated it in a mocking voice, rolled her eyes, and soon people were shaking their heads like I was the ridiculous one. The nickname Ungrateful Rachel was born that night. It didn't stop there. At every family get-together after that, Diane would slip it in. "Careful, don't give that to Ungrateful Rachel. She won't appreciate it." Laura would laugh and act like it was all a big inside joke. Even some cousins started snickering when they saw me. What made it sting more was that my own mom didn't step in. She pulled me aside once and told me, "Just take the clothes, it's not worth the fight." I understood why she said it, but it left me feeling cornered, like no one was in my corner. Meanwhile, Laura leaned into her role of the generous cousin. She'd talk at gatherings about how she loved helping Rachel out, about how she kept her stocked up with things. She painted herself like some noble figure, as though she was keeping me afloat. People clapped her on the back for being so selfless, not realizing she was just passing off bags of junk she couldn't be bothered to throw away herself. For a while I kept my head down, but the more it happened, the clearer it became. If I stayed quiet, this would just keep going. Laura would keep playing the hero, Diane would keep mocking me, and I'd keep being their family punchline. It wasn't just about clothes anymore, it was about the way they were trying to define me. I decided I wasn't going to play along anymore. If they wanted to turn me into a character, then I'd flip the script myself. I wouldn't just defend who I was, I'd make sure everyone saw the truth for what it really was. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing. The next time they tried to make me the joke, I'd be ready to turn it right back on them. At the next family dinner, things were tense before I even walked in the door. Diane was in her element again, sitting at the head of the table like she was queen of the family. I had dressed neatly in a blouse and skirt I'd bought myself. Nothing extravagant, just simple and clean. Diane let her eyes run up and down me before smirking and pointing out loud enough for everyone to hear. "At least Laura's practical donations keep you from wasting money on silly outfits." I hadn't even sat down yet, and the jab had already landed. Before I could react, Laura's husband decided to add fuel. He leaned back in his chair with a grin and announced that I should be thankful Laura was keeping me clothed, as if I would be running around half-dressed if not for her generosity. A couple of cousins chuckled. I caught sight of two more whispering to each other at the far end, glancing in my direction and snickering. The nickname had spread further than I thought. Ungrateful Rachel wasn't just Diane's line anymore, it had become a family-wide joke. I opened my mouth to set the record straight, but Diane cut across me before I could form a sentence. She raised her glass and declared to the room, "We all know Rachel thinks she's above us." The way she said it, sharp and dismissive, made it clear she was daring me to argue. The whole table turned to look at me, some amused, some awkward. I was the entertainment again. I sat down without a word. Instead of snapping back, I made a decision then and there. If they wanted to keep painting me as spoiled and ungrateful, I would use their own actions to show the truth. A few days later, Laura turned up at my apartment unannounced with another garbage bag. She left it at my door with a bright smile like she was handing me treasure. When I brought it inside, the smell hit me before I even opened it. Inside were shoes with holes, sweaters with dark stains down the front, and a handbag with one handle torn off. This wasn't help. It was a chore I had to deal with every time she wanted to play the hero. This time, I didn't shove it into a donation bin and hope no one noticed. I had been toying with the idea of starting a clothing drive at work, something that would give back to the community while also clearing space for people to contribute meaningfully. This bag was the push I needed. I went into my office early the following Monday with Laura's bag in tow. I set up a folding table in the break area with a sign about the drive. I laid out the shoes with the peeling soles, the sweaters with permanent stains, and the handbag that looked like it had been rescued from a dumpster. I stood back and let the sight speak for itself. By mid-morning, coworkers stopped by to check out the table. A few of them burst out laughing, assuming it was some kind of prank. One picked up a sweater, held it up, and asked if it was really supposed to be donated. I kept my tone even and said, "My cousin insisted I wear these, but I thought others might need them more." That was all. I didn't add details, didn't rant, didn't make it dramatic. I let the facts hang there. The reaction was immediate. People shook their heads in disbelief, muttering about how insulting it was to call those donations. Then, something I didn't expect happened. People began bringing in their own clothes. Within 2 days, racks and boxes filled the room with clean, stylish items. Blouses, jackets, kids' clothes, even a few pairs of nearly new shoes. The contrast was impossible to miss. Next to piles of fresh, high-quality clothing, Laura's offerings looked worse than garbage. By the end of the week, the clothing drive had taken on a life of its own. Management let us expand into a conference room to hold everything. The local shelter we partnered with sent a van to pick up the first batch, and the volunteers couldn't stop thanking us. I watched them carefully set aside the usable clothes, skipping right over Laura's items without comment. Even they knew it wasn't worth sorting through. Word spread around the office that I had started the whole drive. Colleagues I barely spoke to before stopped by to thank me. One manager mentioned in a meeting how proud they were to see employees take initiative like this. Laura's trash had done something she never expected. It boosted my reputation at work and created a project that genuinely helped people. The irony wasn't lost on me. Laura thought she was keeping me humble with her bags of junk. Diane thought she was keeping me in my place by calling me ungrateful. But now, in a professional space outside of their control, I had flipped the entire narrative. What was meant to embarrass me became a reason for others to admire me. Still, I didn't gloat or brag. I didn't rush to post about it online or make a big scene. I let it unfold quietly, letting Laura's actions betray themselves. For the first time, I felt like I had taken back some power, not by yelling, not by arguing, but by being smarter about where their mockery could be turned against them. The best part was knowing I hadn't even confronted them yet. They still believed they were steering the story. They had no idea that the garbage they'd been throwing at me had already become the tool I used to expose them, not just to family, but to everyone around me. And I knew, sooner or later, the ripple effect of what I'd started at work would come back around to them. Families talk, neighbors talk, reputations shift slowly. But once that seed is planted, it doesn't stop growing. What began as another cruel joke at a family dinner had now turned into the first step of my plan. They made me the punchline. I decided I'd make sure everyone eventually saw the real joke. And it wasn't me. Diane's birthday party was always one of the biggest family events of the year. She loved throwing it in her backyard, inviting not just relatives but neighbors, friends from church, and anyone else who would come and compliment her cooking. Tables lined the lawn, covered with trays of food. Balloons tied to the porch swayed in the evening breeze. It was the perfect stage for Diane to play hostess, and the perfect stage for me to finally flip the script. I came carrying 2 oversized gift bags, both neatly wrapped with shiny paper and ribbons. They didn't look any different from the other presents stacked on the table. Laura and Diane were busy greeting people and making sure everyone had drinks, so I slipped the bags among the pile without drawing attention. As the night went on, conversations floated around about how wonderful Diane looked for her age, how delicious the food was, how lucky she was to have such a close family. Laura hovered nearby, smiling in that smug way she always did when she knew eyes were on her. I kept my focus steady. Timing mattered. After dinner, Diane gathered everyone in the living room for the traditional present opening. She lived for this moment. The attention, the gasps, the chance to show off. Neighbors leaned in from their chairs while relatives crowded close, balancing dessert plates on their laps. One by one, Diane opened her gifts. A set of scented candles from a neighbor, a fancy serving dish from her sister. She unwrapped each with exaggerated delight, holding them high for everyone to admire. When she reached Laura's gift, she let out a laugh that carried across the room. It was a framed collage of family pictures, with Laura and her children featured prominently in the center. Diane hugged her daughter and declared, "This girl has always been so generous. Look at how much she does for everyone." The line was clearly meant to sting me, and it worked. The neighbors nodded, smiling at Laura like she was some saint. I smiled back, keeping my composure, and reached for one of my own bags. "I wanted to contribute too," I said lightly, handing it over. Diane tore through the wrapping quickly, expecting another serving dish or maybe something from a store. Instead, she pulled out a cardigan. The same cardigan Laura had dropped in her last bag for me. Tan wool, with a stain across the front and a fraying sleeve. Diane froze for a second, confused, then forced a laugh. The room chuckled along, unsure whether this was a joke or not. Before she could recover, I leaned in with a cheerful tone and added, "I thought it was too nice to keep all to myself." The awkwardness rippled through the room. Some people smiled nervously, others looked down at their plates. Diane folded the cardigan quickly, as if trying to make it disappear. I wasn't done. I reached into the bag again and pulled out a pair of ripped shoes. The soles were cracked, the leather peeling. Holding them up with both hands, I said brightly, "These were really special, but I wanted you to have them instead." The laughter this time wasn't kind. It wasn't the chuckle of people sharing a family joke, it was the uneasy laugh people give when they're watching someone squirm. Diane's face tightened, and Laura shifted in her seat, eyes darting between relatives. Laura's voice cut in sharply, accusing me of twisting things, but I kept my smile steady and reached back into the bag. With deliberate slowness, I pulled out the broken handbag, the one with the torn handle and scuff marks all over. I held it up like a prize on a game show. "This one," I said warmly, "felt too meaningful for me to keep. Aunt Diane deserves to share in the love." A murmur ran through the room. People were no longer smiling. Neighbors glanced at each other. One cousin raised her eyebrows, whispering something under her breath. Everyone could see it now. These weren't thoughtful gifts or practical donations. They were garbage. Diane sat stiff, her face pale. She tried to form a sentence, but nothing came out that wouldn't make her look worse. Laura made another attempt to talk over me, claiming I was trying to embarrass them, but the weight of the items on Diane's lap said otherwise. I let the silence stretch for a moment, then gently closed the bag and set it at Diane's feet. I didn't need to say more. The room had already drawn its conclusions. Guests shifted uncomfortably. A neighbor who had been clapping for Laura minutes earlier now avoided her gaze. An uncle cleared his throat and quickly changed the subject, trying to break the tension. But the damage was done. I excused myself soon after, thanking Diane for hosting as if nothing had happened. On my way out, I caught sight of two relatives whispering in the hallway, glancing toward Laura with frowns. The seed had been planted. By the time I reached my car, my phone was buzzing. A cousin texted me. "That was brutal, but someone needed to do it." Another message popped up. "I always thought it was weird how they treated you." Driving home, I realized I hadn't just embarrassed them. I had shifted the story completely. For years, Diane and Laura painted me as ungrateful. Tonight, in front of neighbors and family friends, I showed the truth. They weren't generous, they were just dumping trash and calling it kindness. The whispers at that party would spread. People would talk about how Diane unwrapped stained cardigans and broken shoes at her own birthday. Laura's bragging wouldn't carry the same weight anymore. They could try to spin it later, but everyone had seen it with their own eyes. I left the party calm, satisfied, and ready. This was only the beginning. The image they built for themselves had cracked, and now every family gathering from here on out would carry the memory of that night. And I knew I wouldn't need to lift a finger for the fallout to grow on its own. I'm a woman in my mid-20s, and after that birthday party where I handed Diane her own daughter's stained cardigans and ripped shoes as gifts, things didn't go quiet like before. Instead, the silence had a different kind of weight. The family group chats, which were usually full of Diane's chain messages and Laura's updates about her kids, turned awkward. When I sent a simple greeting, I got short replies. No follow-up questions, no casual chatter. But I could tell from the way messages popped up between others, skipping over me, that side conversations were happening. My name wasn't being typed in the chat, but I was being talked about. The first big test came at the next family dinner. I arrived a little earlier than usual, not because I was eager, but because I wanted to see how people acted when they couldn't avoid me. Walking into the dining room, I noticed the shift immediately. Usually a cousin or two would wave me over, but this time, eye contact was minimal. Everyone kept their voices even, polite, stiff. They weren't mocking me anymore, but they weren't warm of. Laura was already there, sitting at the far end of the table with her arms crossed. She hadn't even looked up when I walked in. Normally, she'd have been front and center, offering to help with serving or talking loudly about how busy her week had been. Instead, she looked smaller, her face tight with discomfort. We settled in for dinner, plates being passed around. Diane kept her tone bright, almost too bright, as she launched into stories about neighbors and recipes. But halfway through the meal, she shifted gears. She didn't look directly at me, but she said loud enough for the room to hear. "Some people just don't understand traditions. They'd rather mock family than honor what's given." The jab hung in the air, pointed and sharp. A few relatives lowered their eyes, pretending to focus on their plates. Others darted quick glances between Diane and me, waiting for me to bite back. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't snap. Instead, I reached down to my tote bag and pulled out something I had prepared. It was a pair of socks from Laura's last donation. White once upon a time, now stained with gray blotches that wouldn't wash out. I placed them neatly on the table beside Diane's plate and said in an even tone, "Since we're sharing traditions, I thought you'd want a piece of the generosity too." A couple of cousins chuckled quietly. Diane's face flushed red, the color climbing up her neck. She didn't reach for the socks. Laura slammed her fork down, unable to hold back any longer. Her voice cut through the room, sharp and defensive. She accused me of humiliating them on purpose, of trying to make them look bad in front of everyone. The room went silent, forks hovering midair. I kept my voice light, even playful, and said, "I thought we were all about sharing generosity." That was the moment the cracks began to show. One cousin at the other end of the table suddenly spoke up. She reminded everyone that Laura had once given her a backpack with a broken zipper, calling it a gift even though it was unusable. The comment slipped out almost like a release of pressure. Then another cousin joined in, mentioning how she'd gotten a pair of sneakers from Laura where the soles peeled off after one wear. The floodgates opened. Around the table, stories started bubbling up. Old dresses with missing buttons, coats that smelled musty, shoes that couldn't be worn. Everyone had a story, and once one person started, the others couldn't stop themselves from piling on. Diane tried to regain control, raising her voice over the chatter. She insisted that people should be grateful for anything free. She said it didn't matter if the items weren't perfect. It was about the intention. But the faces around her didn't look convinced. For years, everyone had accepted Diane's line without question. Now, with so many experiences being shared at once, it was harder to ignore the pattern. I waited until the noise died down, then spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. It's strange that my preferences were mocked so harshly, but no one ever questioned the actual quality of what was being pushed on me. The words landed heavy. The table fell silent. No one reached for food. No one looked directly at me or at Diane. The air was thick with the realization of what had just been laid bare. I didn't push further. I didn't need to. I let the weight of my words linger, and I leaned back in my chair calm. The rest of the dinner limped forward with forced small talk, but the tension never eased. When dessert was served, Diane kept her lips pressed together. Laura barely touched her plate. The cousins who had spoken earlier avoided direct eye contact with them, but exchanged small glances with me that carried a quiet sense of solidarity. Later that night, when I got home, my phone started buzzing again. This time, it wasn't silence. Cousins sent me private messages one after another. One wrote, "I'm glad you finally said it. I always thought I was the only one." Another confessed, "She made me thank Laura for a jacket I couldn't even wear. I hated it but didn't know how to say no." A third message came, "Don't back down. You're not the only one they've done this to." It was clear now that the nickname Ungrateful Rachel had never been about me. It had been about control. Diane and Laura built their reputation on forcing people to accept their scraps and then mocking them if they didn't. For years, everyone had played along because it was easier than speaking out. But that night at the dinner table, the silence cracked. And once those cracks started forming, there was no way for Diane or Laura to patch them up. The birthday party had been the first blow. This dinner was the second. And I could already see it. The story they had spun for years was unraveling faster than they realized. The fallout from that family dinner spread faster than I expected. Within a few days, I started hearing whispers through the grapevine. Diane had wasted no time going into damage control. She had her phone glued to her ear, calling every relative who would pick up. The story she spun was predictable. I was vindictive. I had staged everything. I was out to humiliate Laura. She called me spoiled, cruel, manipulative. According to her, the stained socks, ripped shoes, and broken handbags I had shown were all part of some elaborate performance. I wouldn't have known the exact details if not for my uncle. He rang me up one evening. He's one of those relatives who usually avoids drama, but even he couldn't ignore the storm Diane was stirring. He told me Diane was insisting I had set Laura up, that I was trying to make her look like a fool in front of the family. He admitted he wasn't sure what to believe. That was when I realized I didn't need to run around denying rumors. That would make me look defensive. Instead, I could let people see the truth for themselves, so I invited a few relatives for brunch the following Sunday. Nothing formal, just a casual gathering at my apartment. I picked the ones I knew were on the fence, the ones Diane had probably worked the hardest to sway. I cooked up pancakes, scrambled eggs, fruit salad. I kept the conversation light at first, chatting about work, small updates, and normal family news. My apartment itself made a statement without me needing to say a word. Everything was tidy, organized, and clean. My wardrobe hung neatly in the corner of my bedroom, clearly filled with clothes that were bought with care. Nothing flashy, but all well kept, modern, and mine. There were no piles of hand-me-downs tossed in a corner. No sign that I was surviving on scraps. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward Diane, as I knew it would. One cousin hesitated, then brought up the socks incident. Another mentioned hearing Diane say I was being cruel. I let them talk, listening calmly, then excused myself for a moment. When I came back, I was holding one of Laura's bags that I had saved. I placed it gently on the dining table and pulled out the contents one by one. A cracked belt with peeling leather. Leggings stretched so thin you could see through them. A jacket missing 3 buttons down the front. The fabric fraying at the cuffs. I didn't say anything at first. I just let the items sit there on the table, their condition obvious to everyone present. The reaction was instant. My guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One cousin leaned forward, frowning as she picked up the jacket, running her fingers over the frayed edges. Another shook her head, muttering about how none of it was wearable. I still didn't insult Laura or Diane directly. Instead, I poured more coffee and let the silence stretch, the evidence speaking for itself. It was one of my younger cousins who finally broke it. She admitted, almost in a rush, that Diane had once pressured her into publicly thanking Laura for a sweater she never wanted. She described how awkward it felt, standing there smiling while Laura soaked up the praise, knowing full well the sweater was unwearable. That confession cracked the room wide open. Another relative added that Laura had boasted behind my back, saying she was keeping me afloat with her endless donations. Someone else remembered how Diane once mocked another cousin for being picky when she hesitated to take a torn jacket. One story after another spilled out, and as they did, the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't generosity. It had never been about helping. It was about appearances, about Diane and Laura playing the roles of benevolent givers while forcing everyone else into silent gratitude. When the conversation finally lulled, I spoke softly, choosing just one line. Real kindness doesn't humiliate people. The words settled over the table like a final card being laid down. No one argued. No one rushed to Diane's defense. They just nodded slowly, the dots connecting in their minds. By the time brunch ended, the atmosphere had shifted completely. People lingered at the door, thanking me for inviting them. Their expressions told me everything. They weren't convinced by Diane's smear campaign anymore. They might not say it out loud to her face, but they weren't going to blindly take her side either. After they left, I packed the broken belt, the ruined leggings, and the frayed jacket back into the bag. I tucked it away in my closet, not because I needed the reminder, but because I knew this wasn't over yet. Diane wasn't going to stop trying to spin the story. But now she wasn't the only voice people were hearing. I had shown them the truth without raising my voice, without name-calling, without drama. And that, I realized, was the kind of proof that stuck. The family reunion was the kind of event you couldn't really dodge without raising more questions than you avoided. It was bigger than a regular dinner, bigger than Diane's birthday party. It was the once-a-year gathering where extended relatives from all sides came together. Dozens of people under one roof, kids running in and out, casseroles lining the tables. I debated skipping it, but I knew if I stayed home, Diane would spin it as me being too ashamed to face them. So I decided to show up, but on my own terms. That afternoon, I walked into the hall where the reunion was being held, wearing a simple but elegant dress I had bought myself. The fabric was smooth, the fit was clean, and I wore it with a confidence I hadn't shown at these gatherings before. Conversations dimmed slightly as people noticed me walk in. I could see some eyes flicker over my outfit, and I knew the thought was in their heads. Did Laura give her that? Diane didn't leave it to imagination. She made her way over, greeting me loudly enough for people nearby to hear. With her usual sharp smile, she commented, "Pretty dress. Laura must have helped with that." I met her eyes and smiled. "No, I bought this one. Like the rest of my closet." There was a pause and then a few chuckles from relatives nearby. The kind of laugh that comes from people remembering something you thought had blown over. Diane's face stayed frozen, in a polite smile, but I could tell the reminder of recent events still stung. Laura wasn't as composed. She was sitting off to the side, but the second my words landed, she jumped up, her tone sharp and defensive. She demanded an apology for mocking their kindness and accused me of trying to humiliate her family. Her voice carried across the room, making people stop mid-conversation to listen. I stayed calm. "I'll apologize," I said evenly. "The day you give me something you'd be proud to wear yourself." The room went still. Eyes turned to Laura. For once, she didn't have a quick comeback. She opened her mouth, but nothing sharp came out. Finally, she muttered something about generosity not needing to be perfect. But before she could continue, I interrupted gently. "It should still come with respect. I'm not your garbage bin." The words landed harder than I expected. A hush fell over the room. Someone near the food table actually nodded, and another cousin let out a quiet laugh that wasn't aimed at me, it was aimed at Laura. That was Diane's cue to swoop in. She stepped between us, raising her voice so the room could hear. She accused me of turning family against each other, of sowing division where there used to be harmony. It was her usual move, casting herself as the victim, while making me the aggressor. I didn't argue. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box. I set it on the table in front of Diane and opened it slowly. Inside was a silk scarf, deep blue, folded neatly in tissue paper. "For you, Aunt Diane," I said simply, "because everyone deserves something chosen with care." The scarf shimmered under the light. The gesture wasn't grand, but it was deliberate. It contrasted everything Laura and Diane had tried to push onto me. Instead of tossing trash into a bag and calling it a gift, I had brought something thoughtful, new and chosen specifically for her. For a moment, Diane looked caught off guard. She didn't reach for it right away, her hand hovering over the box. The room watched in silence. Then a voice from the back, a relative I hadn't expected, spoke up, encouraging Diane to take it. Another added, "That's what real generosity looks like." The shift in tone was clear. The scarf wasn't just a gift, it was a statement. It showed what giving looked like when it came with respect instead of humiliation. And it made Laura and Diane's so-called generosity look hollow in comparison. The tension didn't vanish completely, but the dynamic changed. Instead of me being the butt of the joke, the whispers now carried a different weight. People were glancing at me with small nods of approval, while Laura sat stiff and red-faced, and Diane pressed her lips together, clutching the scarf like it might burn her. The rest of the reunion moved forward, but the air had shifted. Conversations picked up again, but they weren't the same. When people came up to me, they asked about my job, my apartment, my life, real things, not snide remarks about hand-me-downs. At one point, I caught two cousins chatting in the kitchen. One whispered, "Did you see the scarf? That's how you do it." The other nodded, glancing toward Laura with a smirk. By the time the night ended, it was clear. I wasn't the target anymore. I had flipped the narrative completely. Diane and Laura weren't the heroes of the family gatherings. They were the ones exposed. I walked out of that reunion with my head high, leaving behind the murmurs that would only grow louder in their absence. The tables had turned, and everyone knew it. After the reunion, the atmosphere around family gatherings shifted in a way I hadn't seen before. Relatives who used to snicker behind their hands or toss sly remarks now greeted me with warmth and respect. It wasn't over the top, just normal, genuine acknowledgement. No one called me Ungrateful Rachel. No one made jokes about me living off Laura's cast-offs. The nickname that had been thrown at me for so long simply disappeared, as if it had never existed. Diane and Laura were still present, but they weren't the loud centerpieces they used to be. At the next dinner, Diane sat further down the table, quieter than usual. She chimed in here and there with small talk, but she didn't launch into her usual commentary about family traditions or teaching younger people humility. Laura kept her head down, focusing on her kids or her plate. Neither of them tried to hand me any bags of clothes. For the first time in years, I left a family event without being forced to lug something home. I didn't chase them. I didn't corner them for an apology. I kept things polite and distant, answering when spoken to but never offering more than that. It was enough. The gatherings themselves felt lighter. Without Diane holding court with her constant backhanded jokes, conversations flowed easier. People laughed at stories about vacations, work, school. It was normal in a way it hadn't been in a long time. One cousin pulled me aside in the kitchen while we were cleaning up after a meal. She whispered that seeing me stand up against Diane and Laura gave her the courage to speak up too. She told me that she'd also been pressured into taking things she didn't want, smiling through it because it seemed easier than fighting. Now she felt freer to just say no. Her words confirmed something I had started to notice. The cycle was breaking. Diane and Laura's version of generosity had been unmasked, and people weren't buying into it anymore. That didn't mean Diane gave up entirely. Every so often, she tried to test the waters. A passive-aggressive remark about young people forgetting where they came from, or a snide comment about how not everyone needs shiny new things. But the difference was in the reaction. Where before the room would rally behind her, laughing along, now her words landed flat. No one echoed them. No one smirked in my direction. Conversations just moved on, leaving her comments hanging in the air like smoke that faded quickly. Laura adapted in her own way. She stopped bragging altogether. There were no more stories about how she kept me stocked up or how she helped me save money. Without an audience willing to clap for her, she simply let the subject drop. She looked uncomfortable at times, fidgeting in her seat, but she no longer tried to shine a light on me to make herself glow brighter. I, on the other hand, started leaning into a different kind of presence at family events. I didn't focus on tearing them down further. I didn't need to. The truth was already out there, and people had seen enough. Instead, I shifted my energy back into my own life, my work, my friendships, and the things that actually mattered to me. When I did bring gifts to gatherings, they were thoughtful and intentional. A book for a cousin who loved reading. A baking kit for one of the kids who had taken up cooking. Small gestures that showed I had taken the time to think about the person, not just clear out my closet. It didn't take long for the contrast to show itself. Relatives started praising my approach without ever saying Laura or Diane's names. They complimented the thoughtfulness of the gifts, the way they felt personal and meaningful. I noticed people looking toward me with quiet approval, while Diane and Laura sat on the sidelines, excluded from the praise they had once demanded. The shift became undeniable at one holiday gathering. My grandmother, who had always been kind but had mostly stayed out of the drama, sat bundled in a chair. I gave her a new shawl I'd found in her favorite shade of lavender. When she unwrapped it and draped it over her shoulders, her face lit up. The reaction wasn't loud, it was emotional. She touched the fabric, smiled softly, and patted my hand. The room noticed. The moment rippled outward. People saw what generosity looked like when it was thoughtful, when it carried respect. No one needed to say it out loud, but the contrast was sharp. This wasn't about dumping trash and demanding gratitude. This was about care. From that point on, the nickname Ungrateful Rachel was dead. No one dared bring it up. It had faded out of use because it no longer fit the narrative. Even Diane avoided it, as if mentioning it would remind everyone of just how badly her plan had backfired. The family dynamic had been permanently altered. I wasn't the butt of jokes anymore. I wasn't the target of lectures or mockery. Instead, I was treated with respect, included in conversations, acknowledged as an equal. Diane and Laura still showed up, but they weren't running the show. They sat on the sidelines, quieter, less influential, their authority chipped away. What struck me most was that the change didn't come from screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. It came from steady actions, from letting their behavior expose itself, from showing what true respect looked like in comparison. I didn't need to win a fight, I just needed to reset the boundaries. By the end of that year, family gatherings were something I no longer dreaded. I walked in knowing I would be greeted with smiles, not smirks. I walked out without carrying unwanted bags of rags. And through it all, I kept my distance from Diane and Laura, not out of bitterness, but because I had no interest in giving them another chance to twist the story. The chapter closed, not with a victory lap, but with quiet satisfaction. Not because I won, but because I made it clear that my dignity mattered more than appearances. And for the first time in a long time, the family understood that too.